let's take a few minutes to think about our motivation, our reason for being here. So there's a saying that the Dharma, the Buddhist teachings, is like a mirror for our mind. So we use an ordinary mirror, the kind that hangs on the wall, to look at our face, our body, our clothes, and check to see if there's anything that needs to be cleaned up or tidied up, fixed up. But we can't see our mind in an ordinary mirror, a glass mirror. It only shows the surface of our body, not what's inside. So the Dharma, the teachings, do give us the opportunity to look at our mind. And the way that works is when we listen to teachings or we read books on the Buddhist teachings, we discuss them with each other, we reflect on them, meditate on them. This gives us a chance to look at our mind, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, and notice if there are certain aspects of our mind that need to be cleaned up or tidied up, that aren't very presentable, aren't very positive or wholesome. And that's really the essence of the Buddhist teachings, is looking at our mind, recognizing what aspects of our mind are problematic, the cause of problems and suffering for ourselves and others, and then work on those to decrease them and eventually get beyond them altogether and increase the positive or wholesome or virtuous aspects of the mind, the ones that bring peace and happiness to ourselves and others. But to do this work, we need to be able to see our mind. So the teachings, the Dharma, give us a chance to see our mind, like looking in a mirror and seeing our mind in the mirror. So this is particularly true with the topic we're looking at tonight. We're going to be looking at mental factors, specifically the afflictive, disturbing mental factors, the delusions. So it can be a bit uncomfortable looking at these and recognizing how big a part they play in our mind and in our life. But we have to do that. We have to see our mind before we can change it and make it more positive, more pure, more beautiful. And the real purpose of doing this is not just for ourselves to have more peace and happiness, but to be able to benefit others, to bring more peace and happiness to others, and eventually bring all of us to the state of Buddhahood, the state of enlightenment or awakening. So remember that and try to make that your reason, your motivation for being here tonight. Okay, so today I sent a file. I hope everyone got it. For tonight's class and next Thursday as well. I think we'll continue on this topic. And this is a continuation of a topic we've looked at a number of times over the last few months, the topic of mental factors. So far we looked at this topic in general, what are main minds and mental factors. So these are all different facets, different aspects of our mind. And we looked at the first three categories of mental factors. The ever-present mental factors, the object ascertaining, and the virtuous ones. So we had 11 virtuous mental factors. I hope you remember some of those. Can anyone name any of the virtuous mental factors that you remember?
Okay. Non-harmfulness, integrity, consideration for others,
The three nons.
ignorance, non-hatred, non-confusion.
Yeah. Joyous effort, pliancy, conscientiousness, yay. I haven't heard of that one. Non-harmfulness. That's compassion, right? That's an important one. One more, I think? Equanimity. Right, good. Right, so we need to, we all have these to a certain extent, but we need to work on increasing them so they become more prevalent in our mind and on our lives, and that is a way to be happier and more positive and beneficial to others in the world. And so tonight we'll start looking at the next group of mental factors, which are the 6 root afflictions. These are afflictive mental factors. But before we do that, I wanted to just do a bit of review of this topic of virtue and non-virtue. I think we started looking at it last time, but I can't remember how far we got. I'm pretty sure we got through the virtue, but I don't know if we got through non-virtue. But it doesn't hurt to review that. So the file I sent you today contains material about this from volume 3 of Venerable Chödrön's, the books that she's been working on, the Dalai Lama's teachings, called Samsara, Nirvana, and Buddha Nature. So that has very extensive teachings on the 4 Noble Truths. And in the section of the second Noble Truth, the truth of the cause of suffering, it goes into afflictions with a lot of detail. So most of what we're looking at tonight comes from that book. So also from that book is this explanation of virtue and non-virtue. So it's pretty much similar to what we find in that text of the mental factors of Yeshe Gyaltsen, but just a little bit different wording. So I thought we could go through that. So I'm just going to read from the file, and then we can stop and discuss things, or you can ask questions. So it says, in general, virtue is that which brings an agreeable result, and non-virtue is that which brings a disagreeable result. So I've never actually come across actual definitions of virtue and non-virtue. I don't know if they exist, but this is generally what... Have you come across? No? Yeah. But this is what they usually say. How do you distinguish virtue and non-virtue? It's usually by way of the result. What kind of result comes? So if it's a happy, pleasant, positive, good result, then that's virtue. And suffering, unpleasant results, bad things, are the result of non-virtue. So that's generally how we tell the difference between virtue and non-virtue. But then there's also a list of these 5 types of virtue as well as 5 types of non-virtue. And these are from this text by a Sangha, Compendium of Knowledge, Abhidhamma Samachaya. So 5 types of virtue. Number 1 is natural virtues. So natural virtues are the 11 virtuous mental factors, which we just went through the list of those. They're called natural virtues because their nature is virtuous. They naturally bring pleasing results. So it's like their nature is to bring happiness, just like the nature of fire is to be hot and burning. That's just its nature. So the nature of these mental factors is to bring peace and happiness. And then the second type of virtue is called related virtues. And these are primary consciousnesses, or also called main minds, and mental factors that become virtuous because they're accompanied by virtuous mental factors. So there is an example here. When compassion, which is non-harmfulness, is present in the mind, so if compassion is there, then the main mind, the mental primary consciousness, and all the other mental factors that are in the same package, that's my term for it, but they all come together in the same mental state, they all become virtuous. Okay, so when a virtuous mental factor is there in the mind, all the other mental factors and the main mind accompanying it, they all become virtuous. Similar to, if you have a glass of water and you put a drop of food coloring, like red food coloring in the glass of water, all the molecules of the water become red. They're all colored by that drop of food coloring. So in the same way, a virtuous mental factor will color the whole state of mind at that moment virtuous. They all become the color of virtue. Okay, so that's another kind of virtue. And then number 3 is subsequently related virtues. These are seeds and latencies of virtue established by virtuous consciousnesses and mental factors and virtuous actions. For example, the karmic seed created by the mind of generosity. Okay, so when we have this thought of generosity, I want to give, I want to help others, and also if we do actions of giving and helping others, then those states of mind and those actions leave imprints, seeds on our mind, and those are also virtue. However, they're not really virtue. The next sentence says, seeds and latencies are not actual virtues. This is an example of the name of the cause, the virtuous path of action, being given to the effect, the seeds and latencies of virtue. So that probably is very puzzling. Why are they not virtue? Anyone know? Anyone have an idea? I mean, the only thing I know is, it comes a bit later on here, that according to most of the Buddhist schools, the tenet systems, both virtue and non-virtue have to be consciousness, minds and mental factors. And so these are not minds and mental factors. They're like seeds left by minds and mental factors. So that's so the type of phenomena, seeds and latencies, what kind of phenomena are they? Abstract composites, right? So it's a kind of impermanent phenomena that isn't consciousness, and it's also not form, but somewhere in between. However, there's an exception to this. It comes a little bit later. According to Vaibhashika, the Vaibhashika school, and also the Prasangika school, form can be virtuous or non-virtuous. For example, like our vows, pratimoksha vows. Most of us have taken vows, and the nature of a vow is said to be a subtle kind of form. Actually, form, you've probably heard that before. It arises when we go through the ceremony of taking the vows. They say kneeling in a crouched position and repeating the words after the master. So as a result, of course, the mind as well, the intention to take the vows. So that combination of circumstances causes the vows to arise in our mind. And they're said to be a subtle kind of form, not a form that can be seen with our eyes, but only with the mental consciousness. So that's also virtue. So in those two schools, form can be virtue or non-virtue as well. But the other schools, this is one of the differences between the different schools. The other schools say, no, only consciousness can be virtue and non-virtue. So this is a bit complicated, but anyway, since His Holiness mentions it here, the seeds and latencies, because they're not consciousness and they're not this kind of subtle form like taking vows, they are not actual virtue. They're just called virtue. But anyway, they do bring virtue as a result. We do a virtuous action, a seed is left on our mind, and then that can, well, of course it leads to happiness, but it also can lead to further virtue. Because having done a virtuous action once, one result of that is the tendency to do it again. Okay, so it can lead to happiness and also to more virtue. And then number 4, virtues due to motivation are physical and verbal actions motivated by the naturally virtuous mental factors. For example, the action of making a donation to a charity is a physical virtue when done with a generous motivation. So if we have a virtuous motivation in our mind and we give an offering of money or food or whatever, that's a virtuous action. And then there's this paragraph about the different schools. Vaibhashikas and Prasangikas assert that virtue includes both minds and forms. They consider virtues due to motivation, physical and verbal actions motivated by virtuous mental states, to be virtues. Since pratimoksha precepts are form according to these two schools, the precepts are virtuous forms. Our vows, our precepts are virtuous forms. But according to the other schools, Sautrantika, Chittamantra, and Svatantrika, only minds can be virtues. So they wouldn't say that form can be virtue. So this, I don't know, may be interesting to you or not, but I find it interesting to know exactly what is virtue. There's so much talk about virtue, how we need to have virtue and get rid of non-virtue, but what exactly is virtue? How do we create it and so on? Then the 5th is ultimate virtue. And this is, here it says emptiness. I think the other text, the mental, mind and mental factors text, I can't remember what that said, but sometimes it's said to be nirvana. Oh, Vasubandhu, Abhidharma Kosha, he says ultimate virtue is nirvana. Here it says emptiness. This is, because realizing it, emptiness, eradicates all obscurations and enables actual virtue to flourish. So it's the ultimate virtue, because when we realize emptiness, we're able to get rid of our afflictions, our disturbing mental states, and our actions become much more pure and positive and virtuous. However, emptiness is not an actual virtue because it's permanent. So permanent phenomena cannot be virtue. It doesn't bring results. Because virtue is the cause of happiness, good results. So it has to be something impermanent, because only impermanent things can bring results. So it's called virtue, it's named virtue, but strictly speaking, it's not. The wisdom realizing emptiness would probably be number 1, natural virtue. Well, no, actually, what would that, let's see, because wisdom is not one of the 11 virtuous mental factors, but there would probably be virtuous mental factors accompanying that, such as faith, such as compassion in the case of bodhisattvas. That's my guess. So I think the wisdom realizing emptiness would definitely be a virtuous mind. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could argue that it's ultimate virtue. But why it's not listed here, I don't know.
So this phrase, physical virtue, is interesting. So we have the intention to be generous, and we write the check. Is that two kinds of virtue going on? Because we have the positive motivation and we do the action?
Well, yeah, the mental state of, I don't know what mental state that would be. I mean, generosity isn't one of the 11 virtuous mental factors, but there's probably compassion involved. Yeah, if we're offering money to feed the hungry or, help the homeless or something like that. So out of compassion, we may be making this generous action. Or it could be faith, for example, making a donation to Sravasti Abbey out of faith in the 3 jewels. So there would be virtuous mental factors involved in motivating that action. So there would be the virtue created by those mental states, and then the actual action of writing the check or clicking on the send button on the computer if you're making an online donation, or putting it in the offering basket or whatever, the physical activity of giving. Yeah. Because they say giving, giving is mainly the mind, the wish to give. Whether you actually give or not is something else, but having that wish to give is itself generosity. So you're definitely creating virtue just by cultivating that state of mind and having that state of mind.
Unfortunately, I don't have a source for this definition, or this, maybe it's a description, I'm not sure, but somewhere along the lines in my studies I picked up these 2 descriptions of virtue. That which is specified and abides as a type of positive or white fruition, or it is taught in Scripture and is of the type that produces happiness as its white, fully ripened result. And then the opposite for non-virtue.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a source for those, but they sound like they've come from a technical text.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Tibetan texts, the Iksha, they usually have definitions for everything. So maybe there do exist definitions for those that I just haven't come across. But yeah, usually I've just heard these general explanations. Could you send those? Thank you. And then he goes on to say, this list of virtues is not exhaustive. Other virtues include, but are not limited to, a Buddha's speech and the 32 signs and 80 marks of a Buddha. So I think those are also examples of forms, because speech is form, something that is heard, an object of the ear consciousness. And then the signs and marks of a Buddha's body would also be form, some kind of at least subtle form. So those are also examples of form that are virtues. Even a moment of a natural virtue can have far-reaching results. When the mental factor of conscientiousness arises in the mind, the primary consciousness and mental factors associated with it all become virtuous. The physical and verbal actions done with that motivation are also virtuous. While the karmic seeds of those actions are neutral, they carry the potency for agreeable results to arise, and for that reason they are subsequently related virtues, although they are not actual virtues. And again, like I say, when we talk about karma and the results of karma, one of the results is to have the tendency to do that action again. Like if you kill, it leaves an imprint to do it again, to kill again. So the same is with virtue. When we do an act of virtue, an act of generosity or act of saving a life, which is also kind of generosity, or helping somebody in need. So one of the results of that is the tendency to do it again. So then virtue leads to more virtue. Okay, then we have the non-virtues. Commensurate with the 5 virtues, there are 5 non-virtues. So number 1, natural non-virtues are mental factors such as attachment, anger, jealousy, and resentment that are non-virtuous by nature. But this doesn't mean that all afflictive mental factors are non-virtuous. So I have in brackets there from another part of the book on page 110, 111. The book says, not all afflictions are non-virtuous. By themselves, ignorance, view of a personal identity, which is also called view of a transitory collection, that's the belief in an I, inherently existing I, and view of extremes, this is another of the wrong views, are neutral. So they're actually neutral. They're not naturally non-virtuous. And he explains why. They are not non-virtuous because by themselves they lack the capacity to produce pain. In addition, these 3 do not always give rise to non-virtuous mental states, because they could even give rise to virtuous mental states on the basis of ignorance or on the basis of believing in a personal I. One may think, I want happiness. How can I get happiness? I want to have a good rebirth in my next life. How do I do that? Oh, I have to create virtue. I'm going to practice the 10 virtuous actions and avoid the 10 non-virtuous actions. So they can actually give rise to virtue and happiness within samsara. So that's why they're not naturally non-virtuous. Does that make sense? So the reason I'm talking about this is because it is a little confusing. And in fact, just recently I came across material by another teacher about the mental factors. And this person had put the 26 non-virtuous mental factors, meaning the 6 root and the 20 secondary. This person thought they were all non-virtuous. So I wrote to this person and I said, where'd you get that? Anyway, so it's not correct that all these 6 root and 20 secondary afflictions are non-virtuous. They are afflictions. They're all afflictions, and we're going to look at that. But we need to understand the difference between affliction and non-virtue. They are not mutually inclusive. Huh?
3 possibilities.
I think there's 4 possibilities. Huh? Yeah, like non-virtuous action of body. Yeah. Anyway, hopefully this will get more clear as we go along. Also, the next section says, all afflictions of the desire realm are non-virtuous except for those 3. Ignorance, view of a personal identity, and view of extremes. The other afflictions of the desire realm are non-virtuous. Although as we go along, His Holiness is talking about other exceptions to the rule. It's complicated. But all afflictions of the upper realms, the form and formless realms, okay, that's not where we are, but there are beings up there in these other realms, they are neutral. They have no anger. There's no anger in the form and formless realms, but they do have attachment, they do have arrogance, they do have some of the other afflictions. Anger's gone. Well, at least suppressed. And he explains why. A degree of intensity is needed for an affliction to be non-virtuous. Since the afflictions of beings in the upper realms are refined, They don't get really, really attached. They have attachment, but not like over the top. They lack the intensity required to create non-virtuous karma that ripens into painful experiences. So they do have afflictions, but they're low level, refined. They're not like out, over the top, out of control. So they never become non-virtuous. Interesting, isn't it? That makes sense, kind of.
And you mentioned they have attachment, not anger.
Yeah.
What other afflictions would they have? What do they all have?
I think most of them. I think, well, at least of the 6 root, the 6 root afflictions, attachment, anger, arrogance, ignorance, and then views, wrong views, which there's 5 types. The only one of those they don't have is anger. They can still have the others. For example, they get attached to the bliss of their meditative state, bliss of samadhi. It's so blissful, so they can get attached to it. But actually, they do say that if you get attached to the bliss of samadhi, it can cause it to degenerate. So they do have to watch out for attachment. It can still cause problems. And arrogance, they can become arrogant. Look at what a great person I am. I have all these wonderful qualities. I'm in this really high realm. So arrogance can arise. And jealousy, yeah. Maybe one god has a higher level than another one. I don't know. But anyway. Okay, then number 2, related non-virtues are the mental primary consciousness and mental factors that accompany a naturally non-virtuous mental factor. So when we have anger, when there's anger in the mind, then there's a main mind, a primary mind, and other mental factors together with it in the same package. They all become non-virtuous. 3 subsequently related non-virtues are the latencies, seeds and latencies left on the mind by non-virtuous minds and mental factors. And again, they're not actual non-virtues, but are ethically neutral. So when we get angry, we act it out through our speech, through our behavior. It leaves a seed on our mind that can lead to suffering and problems in the future. So it's called non-virtuous, but it's not really non-virtue because it's not a mind or mental factor. Number 4, non-virtues due to motivation are physical and verbal actions done with a non-virtuous motivation. So when we act out of anger or attachment or one of the other non-virtuous mental states, or we do something non-virtuous like killing, then this action of body or speech becomes non-virtuous. In Vasubandhu's Abhidharmakosha, I don't know if the other schools agree with this or not, but he also talks about non-vows. Have you heard about those? For example, a butcher, somebody whose profession, livelihood is to kill animals, and so it's like every day, maybe, I don't know how many times a day, they're killing an animal. Or a soldier, a professional soldier who makes I guess they make a promise, an oath to fight and kill. So they say this is it's called a non-vow because it's the opposite to a vow. Like we make the vow to not kill. So there are people who make a vow, kind of like a vow to kill. And they do it again and again. So that's, yeah, we have to be careful about that. We want to stay away from those. And then 5, ultimate non-virtue is, for example, samsara, which breeds non-virtue, although it is not an actual non-virtue. Samsara itself isn't a non-virtue, probably because it's not a mind or a mental factor, but it's the breeding ground, like the environment in which non-virtue can arise and create suffering. So anyway, the main type of non-virtue would be the number one, the mental factors that are non-virtuous. And probably in many cases, if not most cases, afflictive mental factors are non-virtuous. So now we're going to start looking at those, the 6 root afflictions. And again, I've taken this material from that book, Samsara, Nirvana, and Buddha Nature. So first, in general, afflictions. What is an affliction? An affliction, this is from Asanga's Compendium of Knowledge. An affliction is defined as a phenomenon that, when it arises, is disturbing in character, and that, through arising, disturbs the mind stream. And His Holiness explains, afflictions are distinct mental factors that, when they arise in our minds, cause our minds to be unpeaceful and unsubdued. Okay, so that's their nature. Their nature, they are by nature agitated and disturbed. And when they arise in our mind, they don't always arise, but when they do, they make our whole mind disturbed, unpeaceful, unsubdued. So that's the general description or explanation of afflictions. And then he goes on to say, afflictions may be emotions, attitudes, or views. But I've had a discussion about this with Venerable Tsepel. Don't think that these are traditional classifications or divisions of afflictions. I think His Holiness is just saying this because in the West, we talk a lot about emotions, whereas there's no word for emotion in Tibetan language, and I think also in Sanskrit language. They just don't have that word or that concept of emotion. Interesting. And I remember once a translator telling me, this is a Western person who was translating, from Tibetan into English, translating teachings, and this person told me that it gets tricky because when you're working as a translator, and let's say you have a student who's going to see a lama and asking advice, and the student is talking about emotions. So as a translator, what are you going to use? What word are you going to use to translate emotion? And he says a lot of translators will use the word for affliction. They don't know what else to use. But it's not really accurate, because affliction is always something kind of negative and disturbing. Whereas in the West, when we talk about emotions, they're not necessarily negative. Some emotions can be positive, joy, compassion. We would call those emotions love, but they're not negative. So they just don't have a word that conveys what we understand by emotion. So I think when His Holiness says this, afflictions can be emotions, because some of the afflictions would be what we call emotions, like anger, jealousy. But not all the afflictions would be what we call emotions, like ignorance. We wouldn't call ignorance an emotion. Doubt. I mean, you could get emotional, I guess, if you have doubt. I don't know how strong your doubt is. Wrong views, definitely. Those aren't emotions. So we can't, sometimes translators use the word disturbing emotions for these. But that doesn't quite work, because they aren't all really emotions. So that's why he says this here. Afflictions, they could be emotions. They could also be attitudes and views, like wrong views, like the view of a personal identity. So just so you understand that these are not like the traditional divisions. The traditional division of like these 6 root afflictions is into non-views and views. That's how they usually divide them. The first 5 are non-views, And the sixth is a view, and it has 5 divisions. We'll get into that later. Anyway, so there are different states of mind, and they usually arise without our choice. That's good to know, isn't it? No, I'm sure nobody really chooses to be angry or to have jealousy, right? Although when they arise, we sometimes feel really bad. We feel guilty. We beat ourselves up. We feel ashamed of ourselves. But if we ask ourselves, did I choose to feel this way? Did I choose to have this state of mind? Probably not. So we shouldn't blame ourselves or feel guilty. They arise from various causes and conditions. The main cause is imprints or seeds left on our mind from the past. Because we had these afflictions in our mind in the past, they left seeds for them to arise again. And so when the causes and conditions come together, those seeds arise and cause that particular mental state to be there. We didn't choose to be that way. The 3 principal afflictions are ignorance, anger, and attachment. But we're going to look at, the full, because in Lorig, in the study of the mind and awareness, it mentions 6 root and 20 secondary afflictions. I don't know, when we'll have time to go through all of those, but it will at least start with the six root. And remember, not all of the afflictions are non-virtuous. Some are neutral. So, I don't know if we could do this now, look at the 4 possibilities between virtue and affliction. We haven't really gotten into that yet, but something that is, non-virtue and affliction. Something that is both a non-virtue and an affliction. What would be an example? Anger. Okay, so it's non-virtue and it's also an affliction. What about something that is an affliction but not non-virtue? View of the transitory collection, or ignorance, or extreme views. So those are afflictions, but not non-virtue. What about something that is non-virtue but not an affliction? A non-virtuous action. I wonder if you could even say the primary mind, also the primary mind that accompanies an affliction. It's not an affliction. Like the primary mind that's together with anger. That would not be an affliction, but it is non-virtuous because of the... Yeah. Also, any other mental factor, feeling. The mental factor of feeling that is accompanying anger. I think that would not be an affliction. Feeling is not an affliction. So I think we could find lots of examples. And then something that's neither an affliction nor non-virtue.
Faith.
Compassion, faith, virtuous action. Yeah. So I think there are 4 possibilities. Does that sound right? So it's this. Okay, so let's start looking at the first on the list of the 6 root afflictions, attachment. So His Holiness, it's very interesting what he says here, so I thought it'd be good to go through it all. Lots of interesting ideas. Okay, so in general, attachment is a mental factor that, based on distorted attention that exaggerates the attractiveness of a polluted object, in parentheses, an object under the influence of ignorance, wishes for and takes a strong interest in it. So that's a general description of attachment. So the object, there's always an object, and it says it's a polluted object. Other texts use the word contaminated. contaminated, polluted. And the meaning of that is, here it says, it's an object under the influence of ignorance. Other definitions of contaminated or polluted is that it's anything that arises from karma and delusions. Anything arising from karma and delusions. So, pretty much includes everything around us and in us. Our bodies, our minds, the environment, even Sravasti, Abbey. I mean, all of these things did arise from karma and delusion, and in particular from ignorance. All of these are contaminated or polluted objects. So the object is a polluted object, and then there's this other mental factor called distorted attention. Distorted attention exaggerates the good aspects, the attractive aspects of an object. So there is an object what we see as attractive or beautiful or interesting, and then the mind tends to exaggerate the attractiveness of it, make it more wonderful, more beautiful than it really is, and sometimes projects things that aren't actually there. So it's like the mind paints a picture of the object as something really wonderful, really fantastic, over the top. And then we want it. That's the real meaning of attachment. I want that object. I want to own it. I want to possess it. I want to keep it close to me. I want to make it part of my life. I don't want to separate from it. So he goes on to say the object could be a material object, a person or place, or it could be praise or an idea, something more abstract. It could be almost anything. Attachment functions to produce discontent and to perpetuate the cycle of existence. So that's the function of attachment. It leads to discontent, dissatisfaction. What we want is happiness and satisfaction. We might get a little bit of that, a little bit of pleasure from an object of attachment, but in the long run, dissatisfaction, discontent. Like some of the BBCs recently, Venerable Jigme and Venerable Samten mentioned, even you have these wonderful things in your life, but there's this feeling of empty. What did you call it? Emptiness or whole? Something missing. You don't find real satisfaction from these ordinary things like wealth and pleasure and relationships and so on. And it perpetuates the cycle of existence because when we have attachment, we grasp at or run after objects, try to get them, and in the process of doing that, we may create non-virtue. And even if we don't create non-virtue, we're just perpetuating our attachment. We just keep running after these things, and this keeps us in samsara and cyclic existence rather than attaining freedom, liberation. Looking at our own experiences, we can see how true this is. So we've all had experiences of running after objects of attachment. And like Shantideva, there's this one quote in Shantideva about this. He says, attachment never leads to satisfaction because if you don't get what you want, you'll suffer. But even if you do get what you want, you'll suffer. I love that. It's so true. There's only two possibilities. You get it or you don't. Either way, there's going to be problems. So this is a general description of attachment. There are many degrees and variations of attachment. Some instances of attachment that arise in daily life are greed, that wants more than our fair share, more food than the next person in line. Attachment to our ideas that leads to the stubborn insistence on being right, getting into arguments, conflicts with others who don't agree with you. Attachment to reputation, praise, pleasing sensory experiences, like in the 8 worldly concerns, and so on. We also become attached to people, which leads to having unrealistic expectations of them or of our relationships with them. Right? So I think we've all been through that. You meet somebody, you find this person just wonderful, fantastic, and all these fantasies start arising in your mind of how happy you will be together and all these wonderful things you'll do together, all these wonderful experiences you'll have. Maybe some of them might come true, but, usually it leads to disappointment, letdown. I remember talking to somebody who, I think this is a secondhand story. This person heard a monk at Nalanda Monastery tell this story. He was married before becoming a monk. And he had this experience one day. He and his wife were sitting across the table from each other reading. One was reading a newspaper, the other was reading a book, something like that. They were just sitting there. And he looked up and looked over at his wife, and he had this thought in his mind, "You were supposed to make me happy." So that was the start of his journey that eventually led him to be a monk. And I remember, I might be wrong about this, but I think maybe he talked to her about it at some point, and she said she had the same feeling. You were supposed to make me happy. Anyway. Yeah.
View how it is that something like a beautiful mountain stream would be a polluted object.
Even if it doesn't have any pollution in it. Pure water from a source, from the spring in the ground that doesn't have any chemicals or any pollution, you can drink it right away. Yeah, so even that, well, the meaning of polluted, we have to put aside our usual idea of polluted, like, with chemicals or with soap or whatever, unhealthy things. And the meaning is because it arises from karma and delusions. I mean, this world that we are in and everything in the world came about through the karma and afflictions, the delusions of sentient beings. Now, how that works is another matter. Actually, in one of these books, I forget which one, it might be volume 3, volume 2, I can't remember, but His Holiness proposes an explanation of how the world came into existence, but he brings in also this, in Tantra, the Kali Chakra Tantra, it talks about space particles. Do you remember reading this explanation? Which volume is it in? It's really fascinating. Yeah? Okay. Volume 2 of the series, Library of Wisdom and Compassion. Yeah, because Vasubandhu, like in the Abhidharma Kosha, he talks about the world and all the different realms and all the different kinds of beings. That's in chapter 3. Chapter 4, right at the beginning of chapter 4, which is about karma, he says, now where does all this come from? Karma. And then he goes into explaining karma. But he doesn't actually explain the process of how does everything come about because of karma. I mean, this is a Buddhist view. This whole world, samsara, everything comes about as a result of karma. But how does the karma of sentient beings actually produce this planet and everything in the planet, including beautiful mountain streams, flowers? It all comes about due to the karma of sentient beings, and our karma is polluted karma, contaminated by afflictions, ignorance, attachment, aversion, and so on. A pure land, on the other hand, like Amitabha Pure Land, Sukhavati, that comes about through the Buddha's, like Amitabha Buddha's merit and pure attitudes, compassion, love, and so on. So a Pure Land is completely different. Everything in a Pure Land is not polluted. And everything in samsara is polluted. Does that make sense? Attachment to people leads to having unrealistic expectations of them or of our relationships. This in turn leads to disappointment and friction in those relationships and feelings of bitterness or betrayal when the relationships don't continue as expected. So these are some of the problems that arise due to attachment. It can also lead to other disturbing emotions. Anger, for example. The more attached you are to a person or an idea, the more angry you will become when they are attacked or they don't cooperate with you. And then fear, when we have attachment to things or people, there's fear of losing them. So it can also lead to fear. It can lead to jealousy. If somebody has more than we do and we want what they have. What else? Other afflictions, other disturbing emotions that arise from or related to attachment. Fear, yeah. Anxiety, fear and anxiety, worry. It's often related to attachment. Okay, then he goes on to mention other forms of attachment. Covetousness is a coarse form of attachment. As one of the 10 non-virtues, covetousness easily leads to actions that directly harm others, such as stealing or unwise sexual relations. When you covet another person's partner or spouse, then that can lead to misconduct. Other afflictions derived from attachment are, here we go. Miserliness, that's another one, that doesn't want to share our possessions. Haughtiness, that's one of the secondary afflictions, that is attached to our good fortune. I'm so great, I'm so wonderful, look at me. Agitation, that distracts the mind to desirable objects during meditation. Do you ever have that? Yeah, I mean, that's probably the biggest cause of distraction when we are meditating. Sometimes we may get angry, irritated, but more often it's attachment, objects of attachment, running here, running there. So that then we can't develop calm abiding, samadhi. Okay, now here we have an interesting section. Attachment and aspiration are distinct mental factors with different functions. So remember when we were talking about the 5 object ascertaining mental factors, one of which is aspiration, which sounds kind of similar to attachment, and we weren't sure what is the difference. So it's explained here. Although both are attracted to their object, attachment is based on distorted attention that exaggerates its attractiveness or projects good qualities that are not there. Seeing the object inaccurately, attachment clings to it and does not want to be separated from it. We become attached to people, money, possessions, love and approval, good food and other pleasurable sensory experiences and so on, and are certain that the good qualities we see inhere in that person or object. If our perception were accurate, everyone should see the person or object as we do and desire it as much as we do. Clearly, that is not the case. Have you ever noticed that? You find some object, some person really attractive, and you talk about that to somebody else, and the other person says, huh? What do you see in him or her? Or you like that? Ooh. So you can find out that not everybody sees the object the same way you do. So attachment usually involves, or always involves, exaggeration, seeing the object in an unrealistic way, exaggerated way. So that's how we can tell attachment. Now, an aspiration, on the other hand, also focuses on its intended object and takes a strong interest in it, but it is not necessarily, notice he says not necessarily, which means it could be, based on exaggerating or projecting the object's good qualities. There might be some exaggeration there. The aspirations seeking a good rebirth, liberation, and full awakening are based on realistically seeing the beneficial qualities that are present. So people might sometimes think, well, if you want to achieve enlightenment, or you want to achieve liberation, or you want to have good rebirths in your next life, isn't that attachment? Isn't that attachment? So it could be, maybe, if you have exaggerated and unrealistic ideas about these objects, then it could be attachment, but not necessarily. And then he gives a quote. In his Abhidharma text, the Tibetan scholar Chim Chambayang clarified that the aspirations or desire for a fortunate rebirth, liberation, or awakening are virtuous. They are not attachment. And so they do sometimes use the word desire, dopa in Tibetan. They use that word for these goals, liberation. They talk about desire for liberation, desire for enlightenment, but that's not a negative or afflicted kind of desire. Furthermore, Vasubandhu said that objects giving rise to afflictions are polluted. Since Buddhahood and the three jewels are unpolluted, they cannot induce afflictions in others' minds. If someone thinks, when I'm a Buddha, everybody will respect me, he suffers from attachment to reputation, not attachment to Buddhahood. That's a good point. Because I often, in the past, I used to teach these 10-day Introduction to Buddhism courses in like Tushita Meditation Center and so on. So you're teaching a whole bunch of people who are quite new, and when talking about attachment, a lot of people would ask this kind of question, well, can't you get attached to Dharma, to meditation, to the Buddha, to your guru? And that's a common question that comes up. And in the past, I would say, yes, it's possible, but that kind of attachment is better than being attached to money, to movie stars, to alcohol, and so forth, because at least it's getting you on a good track, on a good path. And if you do practice correctly, then eventually you will get beyond attachment. But on the other hand, based on what His Holiness says here, if there's attachment to Dharma, or if there's attachment to your spiritual teacher or to enlightenment, it may actually not, the object that you're attached to may not actually be that, but something else, like attachment to Dharma. It may be knowledge, like you want to know a lot and show off to others how much you know. So it could be more attachment to knowledge and being smart, smarter than others, rather than to Dharma itself. Or attachment to teacher, it may be the desire for attention, the desire to be accepted, to be loved, right? So it's a good point that there's something else going on there rather than the right attitude that we're supposed to have, which is aspiration to develop yourself, to get beyond your afflictions, to reach these higher goals for the benefit of all beings. So if you have the right attitude towards these objects like the three jewels, your teacher, the Dharma, and so on, then it wouldn't be attachment. Does that make sense? And then he goes on, craving is a form of attachment and is usually seen as non-virtuous. However, craving, he puts it in parentheses, quote marks, can refer to other forms of attachment that may be temporarily useful. For example, in the case of someone who is miserly and doesn't want to part with their possessions, the craving to be wealthy in a future life can motivate him to counteract his stinginess and become generous in this life. So craving to have a good situation in a future life where you have wealth and you realize, well, how can I do that? What do I have to do? Oh, I have to practice generosity. Then that can help the person let go of their stinginess and start being more generous. Even though this craving seeks happiness in samsara, it is a step up from craving the happiness of only this life, and thus is considered virtuous. Interesting, yeah? For someone who lives an ethically corrupt life, desire to be born as a deva can induce him to relinquish harmful behaviors and keep precepts. So again, craving can bring about beneficial results. Craving for the bliss of samadhi in the form and formless realms can inspire someone to cultivate concentration in order to be born in those realms. These types of attachment are useful in those specific situations. However, for someone intent on liberation, those same cravings are hindrances because they are enamored with samsaric pleasures. So he seems to be saying that certain forms of attachment or craving can be useful while we're in samsara. They can motivate us to create virtue, to do beneficial things, to create the cause for good rebirths in the future life. But that's as much as they can do, while we're still stuck in samsara. But to be able to get out of samsara, attain liberation, attain enlightenment, all forms of attachment and craving have to be eliminated. They're obstacles. So that's one way we can understand afflictions. Not only do they disturb our mind now, they are also causes to remain in samsara. Because to be free of samsara, to be free of cyclic existence, we have to eliminate all the afflictions, what are called afflictive obscurations. So they have to be, cleared out of the mind to reach liberation. And I remember reading in this book called Destructive Emotions. I don't know if you've seen that book by Daniel Goleman. It's about one of these mind life conferences where they focused on that topic of destructive emotions. And at one point in there, His Holiness said, I was so surprised to hear this. He said, there's one good thing about attachment. It keeps families together. And it's like up until that time, I had only heard negative things about attachment. It's the cause of suffering. It's really bad. You have to get rid of it. So it was interesting. He pointed out a positive side. So, it is true. That's even for, not even talking about good rebirths and future lives, but just for this lifetime. Most people aren't interested in attaining liberation and enlightenment. They're just trying to be happy here and now. But attachment does have that benefit. Mothers attached to their children, and it doesn't have to be attachment. It can be love, it can be compassion, but most ordinary people do have attachment. So at least it keeps families together. It's good for the children, not having their parents desert them and abandon them. And so, anyway, there are some benefits to attachment as long as it doesn't lead to non-virtue, to harm, to destructiveness. Then, Ananda, I guess he means the disciple of the Buddha, says that based on the craving for liberation, our highest spiritual aspiration, which is certainly virtuous, the unwanted forms of craving can be eliminated. The post-canonical Pali text Neti Pakarana speaks of virtuous and non-virtuous forms of craving and confirms that virtuous craving leads to the end of craving. For example, one monastic learns that another has become an arhat, and with desire to attain arhatship too, she practiced diligently and becomes an arhat when he was abandoned craving. Sounds a little bit like competition there. Similarly, a monastic motivated by arrogance thinks, I am as capable as that person who attained arhatship. This propels him to make effort, and he becomes an arhat, someone who has abandoned arrogance. Okay, so these are in the Pali canon, the Pali tradition, forms of craving that can bring about good results where you actually get beyond or free of craving and other afflictions. This is similar to the idea of taking attachment on the path in Tantrayana. Speaking of Tantra, here attachment is employed to make manifest the subtlest mind and use it to realize emptiness and destroy all obscurations, including attachment. So he seems to be saying attachment in itself isn't necessarily negative or non-virtuous or cause of problems. It depends on how we use it, how we work with it. However, how do we reconcile these examples with the statement of Nagarjuna, the great second century Indian sage who spread the Madhyamika middle way view? So R.A. is Ratnavali, do you know? The precious garland? R.A., I think it's Ratnavali. Anyway, one of his texts. Attachment, anger, confusion, and the karma that arises from them are non-virtuous. Now there he seems to be saying all attachment is non-virtuous. Attachment here refers to selfish desire for material possessions, praise, good reputation, and pleasant sensory experiences. Like attachment to this life, attachment to the eight worldly dharmas. Such attachment often leads to non-virtuous actions. I'm glad he says often rather than always, because it does seem that it doesn't always lead to non-virtue. While aspiration for the happiness of future lives can lead to virtuous actions. So he's saying that this quote from Nagarjuna is referring to certain forms of attachment, selfish desire for wealth, praise, and so forth, pleasure. So that can usually or often lead to non-virtuous actions and thus more suffering. Anger and hatred, however, can never be the motivating factors for virtue. They always lead to non-virtue. Well, what about that example we looked at earlier, that woman who was angry about landmines and started this organization to get rid of landmines? And even said, if I hadn't gotten angry about the landmines, I wouldn't have done that work.
And she didn't do that work from a place of anger.
Yeah.
That was maybe the motivator, but she couldn't have done it if she stayed in that state.
Yeah. Because if you're angry, one of the effects of anger, part of anger, is to want to hurt, to want to harm, to want to do destructive, harmful things. So she didn't do that. She acted wisely and skillfully and just did what had to be done to get these landmines out of the land, out of existence. To save. That's why, and we talked about this, compassion. I mean, that kind of anger was really connected with compassion. She had compassion for the people and children, a lot of children and other kinds of people who were killed or mutilated or damaged, harmed by these landmines. So it was really compassion that motivated her. And you mentioned, Venerable Chuni, that man that you met who worked so hard to get rid of the white, what were they? White? white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and you felt, I mean, he said he was angry, but you felt it was really compassion. He wanted to protect people from the racism and the hatred of those people. Yeah, so, and His Holiness also says, like this book, Beyond Religion, he talks about how anger and hatred or hatred, he says, is always wrong, but anger and even attachment are not necessarily destructive. Now he says, even anger is not always destructive. For example, in some situations, strong compassion may give rise to an equally strong sense of outrage, that is, anger, about an injustice. Feeling angry can, in the short term, make our minds more focused and give us an extra burst of energy and determination. In these ways, anger can, in certain situations, make us more effective in getting things done and obtaining what we rightly seek. But when anger extends beyond this practical function, most of the energy it brings is not helpful at all. So if you can, utilize that energy in a positive and constructive way, it can be helpful. Otherwise, it can be destructive. Yeah. And again, anger is an affliction. It's an obstacle to attaining liberation and enlightenment. So if those are our goals, if we want to reach those goals, we definitely have to.
I wonder if that's skillful means in talking with a Western audience, though.
Yeah, I wonder too.
Yeah, because he often highlights how anger, they've done scientific studies that show that how distorted the mind is, like 90% of your thinking is distorted when you have anger active in the mind. And so how can that be helpful? Yeah, it's a burst of energy, but so is a cup of coffee.
Yeah. Yeah. This book, the intended audience for this book, I don't know for sure, but it could be more of a general audience rather than an exclusively Buddhist audience.
What about seeing it like parents, who run after their child that is going to run on the street? There's a moment of anger, but that makes them so focused and gives them a lot of energy to do everything possible to prevent that. But as soon as the child is off the street,
they can look very angry. They can be screaming and shouting, but it's concern. It's coming out of kindness, concern, compassion for the child.
In his book, Open Heart, His Holiness says that I doubt that the energy in anger is ever beneficial. Yeah. A lot of these cases, when we talk about angry, there's nothing else than anger is a secondary thing. And it may motivate us. Like the person is compassionate about the landmines, but they want to do something about it. But they're angry, maybe that it's even happening at all. But maybe they're just so feeling the anger so much that they mistake that for being the real motivator. The same with a person running out to grab their kid so it doesn't get hit by a car. The motivation is compassion for the child. And if anger arises, it's just they're angry that they have to deal with that situation. Why didn't the kid listen to me or whatever, And so anger is often a secondary emotion.
Yeah.
To attachment.
Yeah.
Or concern or compassion even.
They do sometimes say, in fact, it's here somewhere in this text about anger giving us a false sense of power. But then I met a woman some years ago. I can't remember if I told you this story or not, but she had been raped once a man climbed through her bedroom window while she was sleeping, and she woke up to find him on top of her, and impossible to get away. So she got raped, and it was a horrible experience. And then sometime later, she was walking home late at night in the dark and empty streets, and suddenly a man appeared and threw her down on the ground and, was preparing to rape her. And he said these words. He said, "Don't scream or I'll kill you." And when she heard those words, they were the same words that the first man used. When she heard those words, she said this incredible anger. She said, that's what she said. It was anger. She said, "I am not going to let this happen to me again." And that gave her so much strength. She's like really tiny, about 5 feet tall, and, not big this way, very small. She said it gave her this energy to be able to push this man off of her, scream at him, and he got scared and ran away. So, so that made me think, well, in that case, it does seem that anger was useful, because not only did it protect her from getting raped, it protected him from creating the bad karma of committing a rape. And having failed to rape this tiny 5-foot-tall woman, he's probably less likely to try that again, right? So that means other women might have been protected by her anger. On the other hand, if she hadn't felt this anger and instead, just became limp, she would have gotten raped a second time. He would have created that bad karma, and then he would have felt kind of maybe bold enough to try it again on somebody else. So it really made me, I think that was the first time I really started wondering, well, maybe anger can be useful sometimes, especially for women. Women tend to be more vulnerable to harm and are harmed more often in these kinds of situations. So, and of course, you can protect yourself with other factors like compassion and kindness, but for us who are just ordinary beings and still have anger and still have, self-cherishing mind, it isn't necessarily a bad thing. So I don't know, you may have other thoughts about this, but...
The story about the rape, I don't know that I would say anger when you're getting attacked. I would say self-preservation, and you're using the adrenaline to free yourself from such harm. And so that's just kind of a natural response that, we hear it all the time, like a parent whose little kid got under the car or something and they lift the car up. And it's like, how could you do that? It's that same kind of thing. And we wouldn't say that's anger, but I don't see much difference between that and self-preservation to, not having such a violent negative thing happen to you.
Well, she used the word anger. So she said that's what she felt. She was probably still angry about the first one. Still hurting, still traumatized.
Fight or flight response, because that's what we know this as in physiology. They also call it hyperarousal or acute stress response. And in this whole thing, when they go through the whole thing, there's nothing in here about anger. They go through all the usual things that you hear about in the physiology of this. I agree with you. Even they talk about emotions, but they say individuals with higher levels, and I've read this before, of emotional reactivity may be prone to anxiety and aggression. They have made, which illustrates the implications of appropriate emotional reaction in the fight or flight response. I have read things before about this where people can be more, their emotional reactivity can be higher. They can be more prone to anger and things. But I think actually there is I used to work with, know some wrestlers when I worked with sports. And they used to take advantage of this too. And I think they would use the word anger to describe this. But I actually think they were able to do this hyperarousal thing. I don't know if it has to be associated with anger. I'm not saying it wouldn't be. I'm sure it could be. But I actually think it's the response to perceived harm, event, attack, or threat to survival is how they describe that, a physiological reaction. So I guess it could happen either way, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not advocating anger. I'm not saying anger is good. But, for so many years, I was just completely, accepting these teachings on anger being totally bad. I remember Lang Myeshi once saying, there's never any reason to get angry, and it's only bad, it's only negative. But now I'm starting to, well, in some cases, it could actually lead to good results. Of course, we have to be free of it, to be on the path to get liberated, to get enlightened, and so on, and benefit sentient beings. I don't deny that at all. But while we're in samsara and we're, dealing with all these difficulties in samsara, and anger does come up, I mean, of course, it's better not to have it, but it does come up. And if at least it can be used, it can be transmuted or transformed into something useful, something positive, it's certainly better than just suppressing it and acting it out in destructive ways, but a middle way of tapping into that energy, and like that woman with the landmines, using it, channeling that energy into something constructive. I know you have to be careful, because you might think I'm doing this for the good of others, but there could be other things going on, other issues going on, so you have to watch that. But anyway, how much time? Should we stop now? Let me just finish this paragraph. Yeah, so anger and hatred can never be the motivating factors for virtue. They always lead to non-virtue. Here, confusion refers not to the self-grasping ignorance that is the root of samsara, but to the ignorance that does not understand karma and its effects. Okay, so he's talking about this quotation from Nagarjuna, where he says attachment, anger, confusion, and the karma arising from them are non-virtuous. So he's saying confusion here doesn't refer to self-grasping ignorance, but ignorance of karma. It doesn't understand karma. While self-grasping ignorance can also precede virtuous actions, the ignorance that has a skewed view of ethical conduct will lead to mental, verbal, and physical non-virtuous paths of action. And later in this section, when His Holiness is talking about ignorance, and he actually goes through many different kinds of ignorance, ignorance about karma, not understanding karma, cause and effect, is not simply not knowing about it, because there's a lot of people in the world who never even hear about karma, don't know about karma. So it doesn't refer to that, but either strong disbelief, like you know about it, but you don't believe it, you reject it, or temporary disregard for it. You may find yourself in some circumstances and you kind of know stealing isn't good karma, it's bad karma, but well, maybe I'll just take it anyway and then do Vajrasattva afterwards or something purifying. So you're kind of pushing it aside. And he says, this ignorance cannot discern virtuous from non-virtuous actions, does not accept that happiness comes from virtuous actions and unhappiness from non-virtuous actions, or does not fully believe this. So that's the kind of confusion that Nagarjuna is talking about here that leads to non-virtue.